if we struggle with trust, we'll want to generally be in more control. And so we will attract and we will create relationship dynamics, particularly because relationships are the crux of our existence, where we can control those relationships. Now, as a byproduct of that, a female that wants to be in her feminine, she may attract a man that is either hyper-masculine or hypo-masculine that may appear as feminine because she's taking that masculine role. So if that woman doesn't trust, because she's maybe been hurt by men, maybe by her father, there's a core masculine wound there, or just by men in general, or she's had to wear many masks over the year to survive and maybe even thrive, she will just continue to reinforce that point of I'm unsafe in the world. The way I create safety is through trusting myself, controlling. So I will create circumstances, environments, relationships that allow me to be in that control. Therefore, when we're talking about sexual intimacy and polarity, it's going to be very difficult to switch out of that mode.
Well, hello there and welcome to this episode of the Terri Show. I think you're going to love this fascinating conversation that I just had with Stefanos Sifandos, who is someone who I know through his wife, Christine Hassler. She's an amazing coach. I've known her for a really long time. And after they got married and had a baby, I started following him and I was really interested in his work around love, sexuality, sensuality. So he has over 20 years direct experience in the personal transformation space. And he really has great insights into human nature. We talk quite a bit about sexuality, sensuality. He shares his story. I really think that you are going to love this episode with Steph. He was wonderful. So I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Super duper excited. But the first thing I'm always wondering, what are people's backstories? Like for you, I know you've been doing this for 2 decades, but what compelled you to get into the world of empowerment? Because that's what you do, but you really are a specialist in relationships. So tell me what brought you here.
I remember sitting in a lecture one day. Dr. John DeMartini it was one of his events many years ago. I was in my early 20s. And he said, our greatest voids become our greatest values. And I really, I reflected on that. And in short, the shortest way to answer your question is that, right? And so I felt very devoid of relationship and devoid of intimacy and contact and trust growing up. I didn't feel I could trust my environment and the people in my environment. It was very volatile and inconsistent. And so growing up, not only did I experience that and become that myself, and I looked for that because I wanted to reinforce that reality, I became that in such a way that it was so painful, but I didn't know what the pain was. And so I needed so much pleasure to replace that pain. The greater the pain, the greater our pleasure needs to be to numb that pain. And so I found myself in adrenaline-seeking activities, sex addiction, love compulsion, anything that, travel, novelty, variety, anything that would really stimulate me so much that I would not be aware of what I was running away from. And so, that relationship piece, I longed for it so much, but I did not know how to be with it within myself and with others.
Wow, you just encapsulated the story of so many people from a therapeutic point of view of why. And all these sayings where people are like, I'm never going to end up like my parents. And then people just fucking end up like their parents, where they're like, I'm never going to treat my kids this way. I'm never going to scream, or I'm never going to. But if you don't learn a different way, a better way, then you will, because those are like your default factory settings, kind of. Not your factory settings. I think we're going to call them the default settings, because I think our factory settings, if we say what is our actual nature, is to love and be in harmony and communicate and all of those things. So for you, how did you get from, because you really are talking about addiction, right? Because that's exactly what you were saying, love addiction, sex addiction, but anything that we are so hardcore using to avoid our feelings, of course, is addiction. So what was that path like for you?
Very tough, in the sense that it was laden and ridden with guilt and shame, anger towards myself that I then didn't want to feel, and then projected outwards. So I would blame my partners for feeling a particular way, or I'd blame my environment or the people in my life. And not only would I be short and abrupt and impatient and abrasive and very rude and aggressive in my demeanor, because I had so much tension And the only way I knew how to be with that tension or to release that tension was through extreme exercise or extreme adrenaline seeking activities that put me in danger or some form of danger, right? That required me to be hyper focused in the moment, or orgasm or sex. And I explored Eastern mysticism and Eastern sexual practices because I had a yearning for philosophy, and I still do explore that, but from a very different place now. But really, all I wanted was peak experience, and I perceived that there will give me a peak experience. And so the transition for me was I had to personally hit rock bottom. And the way that I hit rock bottom, it was for me the rock bottoms of all rock bottoms, and I had to stay there for a while. Was I essentially just I got caught cheating, and my partner at the time found out that I was cheating, and I was dishonest and in the relationship. And from there, me witnessing her pain, it evoked a great deal of shame in me. And what it also brought to the surface were memories and feelings that I had repressed for so long. And the short of it is, I just didn't want to be that person anymore. And I just committed my life to change. I committed to being the person that I knew I was meant to be, almost that, who am I truly? That curious, loving presence, right? That is innocent, that carries innocence. But I had not been behaving that way in any capacity. And so I spent many years inwards, many years in solitude, many years seeking support and help, further educating myself and plummeting to even greater depths that I don't think any human being should go to. But at the same time, every human being that wants to experience a profound change needs to go to. And that's almost like just the way that we are in our collective consciousness at the moment in terms of what really is required for us to change. And so many of us require that very hard hitting. And it's not the only way, but so many of us require that in order to actually shift out of the paradigms that we find ourselves stuck in. And so for me, that was it. And I just committed to that path no matter what. No matter what was laid out in front of me, I was either going to commit suicide, end up in a mental asylum, or move through this thing that was my life. And very gratefully, it was the latter.
Thank God. So you are happily married, you have a child now.
I
And
do.
are these things that you, when you were younger, you wanted in your
No,
life?
not at all. The exact opposite, Terry. The exact opposite. So I was very clear. My friends, when we were in our late teens and 20s, oh, I'd like to have a child by maybe 30 or 32 or whatever. I'm like, I look at them, what the fuck is wrong with you? I'm never having children. Why are you even talking about getting married? That's never going to happen. Because I experienced my parents. I experienced what I saw in them and what I witnessed in my friends' parents as well, which was just chaos in the household and complete power struggles and abuse and violence and aberrance and all of that. I'm like, I don't want to experience that. My mother would often say, if I didn't have both of you, my brother and I wouldn't be in this marriage. My parents spoke badly and ill of each other in front of us and to us, as myself and my brother. It's very confusing growing up. I thought, if this is what marriage is, if this is what intimate union is, I didn't have that language back then, but if this is what relationship and marriage is, I don't want any of that. So to be very transparent, it wasn't until I'm 40 years old now, I was 35 years old. And I'm driving to my tantric practitioner's house and I'm in tears and he's there waiting for me. We're working on some deep father stuff at that point. And I'd done a lot of work on the father wound per se prior to that. But we were just unpacking some stuff. And that was a very tumultuous time in my life as well. It was before a major turning point. It's raining and the sun just breaks through the clouds. It's a sun shower and the sun shines on me through the windscreen. And it's very poetic, but it's very, very profound what happened. What happened next was this very clear thought that, oh, I can have children. I actually think I want a child. It was very deep for me. And so literally 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, was when I thought, oh, I'm ready for children.
Wow. Which really does, though, speak to the healing work that you did, because obviously to have that epiphany in that moment, somewhere down deep, you realized it was possible to do it completely differently than what you experienced.
Yes. Yeah, very much so.
So how is being a father, given everything that you've been through?
Yeah, you get me teared up now, Terry.
Now, if you cried, I'm going to cry. We're all crying.
She is my light of lights. I I understand my relationship with women and where it's come from and how I've moved through that to then be blessed with a beautiful daughter, and a beautiful wife and a partner and a mother that is phenomenal. I look at that girl every day and I have tears. I'm so grateful for her and the light and the life that she is. She's so profound in her teachings of what she shows me and what she reflects to me. And you mentioned something earlier about I'm never going to be my father. I couldn't tell you how many times I've said that. And I also simultaneously have held the awareness of I'm going to be like my father, and in many ways I am like my father. And over the years, I've matured with that statement and those statements, and I've embraced the wholeness of it as opposed to just polarizing it. And a few months ago, she wasn't sleeping, and I was rocking her and bouncing her, and I felt myself get so frustrated, and I felt her feel that frustration, and she started crying more, and the guilt that I felt, oh, and even let me tell you the guilt that I felt, and immediately thought, oh, I'm being my father here. What is going on? Like, I'm a terrible father. I'm the worst. Like, man, it is a journey.
But what's so interesting about that, and thank you for sharing that because it's so real, right? It's the truth about how it is to parent. But you had a feeling of frustration. It's not like you did anything, and to think about the profound guilt that just having that feeling, and I think the duality of parenting, it's just like the duality of life, where that's normal, right? To feel frustrated. And if you're lucky enough to have a good partner, it's in those moments that you can be like, maybe it should be your turn now, and maybe I can take a break. But what I found from parenting, and I wonder what your thoughts are, is that any unresolved injuries I had in my life, because I became a parent differently, I married a widower. So I suddenly had 3 acting out angry teenage sons,
Wow.
like no kids and then kids. So I always like to say, I skipped the terrible twos and just fell into the terrifying teens because it was like, whoa. And anything that I hadn't resolved, like all of these memories started getting activated, things that I literally didn't even know were there, honestly, where my kids doing something or being somewhere where I don't think that they should be. And I remember saying to Vic, my husband, I was like, Ben can't be at that kid's house. He's a bad kid. He's under house arrest. Like, do you even know? Like, why'd you let him go there? I called up Ben and I was like, hey, you are not staying at that house. And he was like, why? And I was like, because that kid's not a good kid. And I don't want you getting caught up in anything. He's like, I remember him being like, why do you care? And I was like, because I love you and I'm getting in the car. So either you can be outside when I get there or I'm coming in. He was like, oh my God, okay, whatever. So of course he was all mad, but I was doing what my parents didn't do. And there's something very corrective in that experience where you get to do it better. But then the child in me was like, oh my God, it's a miracle worse things didn't happen to me in my life. Where there wasn't, because I was the youngest of 4, my parents were divorced, there was like a lack of supervision because my mother was like, you're the good one. I never worry about you. I'm like, I'm 17 and look 25. You should definitely worry about me, buddy. But, you're the good one. You've never caused me any pain. I'm like, okay, well, I wish I could say the same. But in the meantime, I wonder, as you hit different developmental phases with your daughter, or even now, because she's over 1 now, yeah?
No, she's 6 months, six and a
Oh
half
my God,
months.
wow.
Yeah.
Why does it feel like that was just, I'm on COVID time, but okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we all are.
are you are you having anything? Because here's what I noticed, and I noticed it because I inherited teens maybe, but with my therapy clients, different phases of development where they had injuries that still needed attention, when their kid got to be that age and was acting a particular way, that would get kicked up for them. And either they would do what you did, which was feel badly about how they felt, but not act it out. I mean, some would act it out, but most were able to go, how I felt scared me. The feeling inside of me that I felt so much frustration towards the kid, especially people from homes where there was violence, where they're like, I could have seen myself. I didn't do it, but I feel terrible. And I'm terrified. I don't trust myself. And, then we would go back to the original injuries of what are the things that were still activated. But your baby is still kind of young. So,
Yeah.
so maybe you haven't gotten to those things yet. And maybe you won't. I don't know. But I'm just curious.
Yeah, I perceive myself to move through those things, and I've worked with so many clients throughout my career that I feel I believe I've seen many similar things to what you have seen, and exactly as you've expressed it then. And in saying that though, like I'll give you another example where again she just wasn't sleeping and she was just in so much pain, and I was getting frustrated, and she was just sort of throwing her head around, and she threw her head around, and I jerked, and I quickly jerked to grab her because I didn't want her, locking back. But I was also frustrated. Now, I grabbed her head and I brought her close to me, but I did it very fast because I didn't want her to fall out of my arms, and that scared her more. And I had more guilt because I was too rough with her. I'm too like it just doesn't. But that frustration that I'm feeling is frustration that's very familiar to me from my father and my mother, very familiar. And I can pinpoint so many different times. And I have no doubt, and maybe I'm creating this, but I have no doubt that as she gets older, she's 2, 3, 4, 10. There will be times where I'm working with my inner child, the parts of me that are that age as well. I'm so certain of that.
Yep.
I'm prepping myself for that.
Yep. But how amazing that you have. It's funny, the last time I was talking about inner child, I had Christine on the show, your wife, who
Yeah.
is actually an old pal of mine.
Yeah.
And we were really diving deep into the inner child stuff. And you just said it perfectly, because that's sort of exactly what I'm saying about those developmental places, that it's the inner child that's like, hey, I need something. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about dating, sensuality, sexuality, a lot of the stuff. I love your Instagram. You guys follow Stefanos on Instagram. Don't worry, everything will be in the show notes. But I like the content because I feel like you're hitting things about relationships, about sex, sensuality, but you do it in a way that I find it very accessible and very honest, right? So I appreciate the way that you present it. You really do keep it real. So one of the topics that you talk about is keeping your fights clean and your sex dirty. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So essentially, one of the key foundational principles of being in union together, being in deepened intimacy, is nurturing each other's and prioritizing each other's nervous systems. Like you've got to know your partner's wounds. You've got to know their pain, their history, right? Their proclivities, their values, their infliction points, their triggers. It's very valuable to know that. And it's very valuable for both people to prioritize each other in that way. And when we do, what tends to happen is the tension, the conflict, the disagreement that we have is very different. It comes from a more mature place. It doesn't come from a regressed childhood or teenage place. It comes from a place of wanting to expand beyond our conditioned bodies, right? Beyond our conditioned nervous systems. And when we do that, we're able to access deeper sexual intimacy, more explorative sexual intimacy, more curious sexual intimacy, because there's less blocks there. There's less shame that's a retracted energy. There's less fear that holds us back. Like every Sunday, I'll release a post that is very evocative. At least the imagery is. But the reality of those posts are, when you really read them, and if you look at them over the weeks, it's not really about sex. It's not really about the act of sex. It's more the energy of sex, yes. Sacred energy exchange, sure. But it's really about attending to each other, knowing each other and self in deeper ways, that then sex becomes a vehicle for deeper exploration of consciousness, but also deeper feeling. And that's really what it's about. And look, the images are provocative and evocative because it might get some eyeballs on there. My hope, my anticipation is that people can see beyond just that. That's a very important part of intimate relating, and also see what's underneath that, which is the shadow exploration.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your Sunday post, you see the post, but then when you actually read the text in the post, that's really what it's about. If you're looking for this, there needs to be safety, there needs to be whatever. So I was telling you before we went live that my crew, like so much of the people, and there's lots of people, but a lot of the people who are in my regular crew are very high achieving women, high functioning women. I would call them, high functioning codependents, even though it doesn't look that way, but that's also what's happening. And one of the biggest complaints and things that people talk about in my groups and in my coaching stuff is the whole thing with sex, that because they're so in control, that there's a percentage of those women who find it very difficult to surrender to their partner and to surrender. And it's almost like, I don't like the term alpha female necessarily, because I feel like there's a lot of negative stuff that gets evoked from that.
Agree.
But there's something about the person who's kind of keeping it all going, probably doing a lot of the emotional labor in the relationship, in the home, but in decent relationships. But again, sex becomes, from what they're sharing with me, like something like get it done, right? Like check it off the list, having sex once or twice a week, making sure like, it's important, but they're not really there. And it's like a lot of control. So for women like this, how do you suggest the surrendering process? Like, what do you think needs to be present in order for that to happen?
So much juice in that. So I'll pull that back a little bit and maybe just give some context as to not so much why that is happening, but more so why that's a continuous pattern. At the core of that are a number of things, and one of them is trust. And so if we as individuals put aside male, female, feminine, masculine, any of that just for a moment, just as people, if we struggle with trust, we'll want to generally be in more control, especially if we want to be part of the world. Otherwise, we will retract, become nomadic, become a hermit, whatever it may be. We really pull away from the world. But if we want to be in the world, we want to ensure that as much of the world that we are a part of, we have control over. And so we will attract and we will create relationship dynamics, particularly because relationships are the crux of our existence, where we can control those relationships. Now, as a byproduct of that, now let's come back to a female that wants to be in her feminine. She may attract a man that is either hyper-masculine or hypo-masculine that may appear as feminine because she's taking that masculine role. Now, when we look at masculine-feminine dynamics or even contrast or polarity, it's two wings of the same bird. There are other terms for it. Michaela Boehm says, go and flow energy, do and be energy. There's active, passive energies, yang and yin. Don't even worry about masculine and feminine. Just every human person has this duality. You mentioned duality earlier. It's one of the ways that we learn. For me, duality creates distinction. Distinction creates a richness in learning, which eventually I follow Advaita Vedanta, which is a non-dual philosophy, which brings us back into non-dual reality, right? Let's not go too deep into that, but it's a beautiful thing to understand, right? When we just create separation from a healthy place. So if that woman doesn't trust because she's maybe been hurt by men, maybe by her father, there's a core masculine wound there, or just by men in general, or she's had to wear many masks over the year to survive and maybe even thrive, it will be very, very difficult. She will just continue to reinforce that point of I'm unsafe in the world. The way I create safety is through trusting myself, controlling. So I will create circumstances, environments, relationships that allow me to be in that control. Therefore, when we're talking about sexual intimacy and polarity, it's going to be very difficult to switch out of that mode. Makes it very, very challenging, especially with the men that they're attracting, because they don't want the hyper-aggressive man or the hyper-controlling man either. Then there's massive conflict there. They also don't want that hyper-passive man because that's not really serving them either. Yet at some level, it feels really safe. And so to answer your question, we have to do that inner work. That inner work is a big part of being in healthy relationship. We have to be responsible for our patterns. Now, our patterns to me aren't good or bad. They're either desirable or undesirable. Yep. We either still want them or we don't. They're coming from the past or they're not. And if they're coming from the past, do they suit who we are today and who we are becoming? If the answer is no, and that woman wants to prioritize a very certain type of intimacy and polarity, then some changes need to be made. And it can be very scary though. Very scary.
I agree. I feel like the work from a therapeutic point of view, if we can get our own self-work done, as you've been sharing your story, I've got my own story of a million years of therapy and going through the fire of making decisions. Like, it isn't just, I always get like weird when people are talking about like authentic self, and they act like your authentic self is just like wrapped in a bow. And if you could just have the right words or whatever, it's going to pop out like this fully formed authentic self. And I've always seen it, being a therapist for 25 years, as someone we develop and we make choices. Exactly what you're saying. Is this pattern working for me now? even if it's the way I've always done it to make me feel safe? Is my dissatisfaction now making me hit a tipping point where I'm willing to face whatever it is that made me feel unsafe? Can I talk about it in therapy? Can I figure it out? And the answer is yes. When people are in long-term relationships, which a lot of the people in my crew are, there's a dual thing about changing, because you're changing yourself, but you're also changing your relationship dance and having conversations and all of those things. So great advice of what you're saying is start within and try to understand why this has been the way that you've done it. And then you got to really be brave. It's just like changing anything, right? It's scary as crap because you're not masterful at that thing. You weren't masterful at healthy relationships. You weren't masterful at being a parent. You learned those things. You chose those things and you did the inner work that you needed to do to be able to actually do those things. So I feel like it's very good and hopeful advice. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing I would add to that as well is I like to work and play with people's strengths. And so if you're bringing an archetype of person to me, and we're talking about control being at the center point of their life, their need to control, feeling unsafe in some way, what goes side by side with control is a need to understand. And so if we can explain as coaches, therapists, whatever our titles are, but as journey guides, if we can help explain to them what's happening for them, they can feel at ease because there's more known in their environment. Now, from there, we can open them up to feeling what has been unfelt in very safe ways. This is where we can help them take themselves to their window of tolerance in their body somatically so they feel uncomfortable, but then help them teach them how to bring themselves back into regulation so they can, close those trauma loops. So that's a longer process, of course, but that's the stuff that keeps us grounded in those patterns that we don't really want anymore as well. And then there's the reward mechanism of how do I feel good in my body and safe in my body and pleasure in my body again. That's another thing because we seek often, like we seek pleasure in all the wrong places. And the opportunity we have is to seek pleasure in the quote unquote right places by clearing the clutter of our past. Now, part of that is through creating new narratives and new stories. And part of that is through allowing the somatic body to be free of that pain and that trauma as well.
Love all of that. So good. All right. I'm going to ask you a question about boundaries, and then I want you to tell us where we can find you and what you are up to. So personally, what has been your most challenging boundary struggle and how did you overcome it if you have?
Oh, this is good. So I grew up in a very confrontational environment. And as a young child, I struggled with confrontation. As a teenager, coming into hormones, losing a lot of weight, I was very overweight, all those things, I started finding my voice and finding my boundaries, but in an excessive way. I live a life of excess, right? And extremity. That's part of my personality. So I would either be all in on conflict, super aggressive. I did so much physical fighting when I was younger in my teens and late teens and 20s. And so I just work in these extremes. And so I've then slingshotted from that and saying, well, I don't really want to cause more conflict because I'm just going to take it to aggression. I'm just going to take it to violence, like verbal violence or physical violence. My thinking is there's no point in having the conversation unless I'm willing to go all the way. And so what I've learned over the years is to set healthy boundaries around what my needs are and what I don't like by first observing what's happening in my body and seeing and noticing the tension, the physicality of what's happening and what I think I want to do with that. And then asking myself, well, what would love do now? And what would future Steph do? What would a new version of me actually do with this if I could think that way? And sit with that and then make a request of my friend or my partner or, hey man, that really hurt me what you said. This is what I felt. Can you elaborate on that? Was that what your intention was? That's been quite foreign to me, but that's also, we teach what we need to learn the most, right? And so that's why I'm prominent in the men's space because I want to learn more about myself. I want to learn more about how to be with other men as well. And of course, how to be with women, all those things. So that's a boundary and I'm still working on that. I'm still refining that big time.
But that's major. So thank you so much for sharing it. So I know that you and Christine teach something together. So tell us a little bit about your course. And if you guys don't know Christine Hassler, I think you do. I've been on her show a bunch of times. She's been on my show. She's wonderful, a lovely person, beautiful, beautiful friend, very smart. What are you doing together? Tell me about it.
Yeah, and she speaks very highly of you as well. I said, hey, Terri, I'm going on her podcast. I'm quite excited. She goes, yeah, Terry's an old friend. She's lovely. So back
The
at you.
best.
So we have an amazing program called Be the Queen coming up in November. Exact date to be determined. It is a virtual online live training and event. It is not only for single women, but mainly single women. But we do get a percentage that are in relationship and wanting to learn more about themselves in relation to that relationship. But really is a journey of healthy dating, clearing and healing old wounds, expanding into a new version of self. My wife and I teach it together. I'm the only man in the space. It's a tremendous honor to be with so many women in that space. We've been doing this for a few years now. And we're very excited about it. So I can give you the links to that, of course. And then every month here in Austin, I do something called breath work for the feminine. And I will be expanding this to other cities in the US. But the next one's November 7th. Christine is there as well. We teach that together. That's mainly me leading that, but I bring her into the container because there needs to be a female there. There needs to be someone that understands women from that perspective. And I also have other female practitioners as well. It's not just breath work. It is deep somatic healing, but it is deep into dating dynamics, relationships, expanding and healing that collective masculine wound. And that's a really powerful 3-hour, 4-hour immersive.
Amazing. So how do people find you?
On my Instagram at Stefanos Sifandos or my website, stefaноssifandos.com.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us today. I really appreciate you and the work that you're doing. We will have to do it again.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you.